Greetings, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this, what we're calling a Reckford adjacent event, a reading group discussion on the book, Me and My House, James Baldwin's Last Decade in France, which is a book written by the speaker who will be the 2022 Reckford Lecturer at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. My name is Pat Parker, and I am the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sharon Holland, who will be leading this discussion. This is an event that is going to kick off the year 3 of an initiative that is very central to the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, which is the Race, Memory, and Reckoning Initiative. And so it's my pleasure to introduce, to hand this over to Sharon Holland. And Sharon, please do introduce yourself and the panelists who will be leading this discussion. And thank you all very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. I hope folks can hear me out there, and you'll hear a little bit of music behind me, and that's Gloria Lynn. I want to say, in honor of this book discussion, welcome to my house. And in my house, there's always music playing. And I'll show you a slide that'll let you know why the Gloria Lynn is playing in the background today. I am really thrilled to invite all of you to this brown bag lunchtime virtual discussion of Professor Zaborowska's wonderful Me and My House, James Baldwin's Last Decade in France. I have invited, before I let you know who my colleagues are here, I just want to say this is being co-sponsored by American Studies, by the IAH, obviously is the lead sponsor, and also by Critical Ethnic Studies. And we have with us the wonderful Professor Emile Kemeng, who is the convener of the Critical Ethnic Studies Collective and a professor in Romance languages and author of an award-winning book on Mayan culture and the Mayan world. And I am just thrilled to be in conversation with you always through the work we do on this campus. I'd love to introduce my colleagues here. I'll go alphabetically. I think I'm going to introduce you fully to both of them right now. And then I'll launch into my introductory words about, and of course the music's gonna stop playing because that's what always happens, right? As soon as I get to that slide, people are like, there's no music. First, we have Meta Dua Jones, who has authored The Muse is Music, Jazz Poetry from the Harlem Renaissance to the Spoken Word, from the University of Illinois Press, published in 2011. And that book was awarded the honorable mention for the MLA William Sanders Scarborough Prize. Her current manuscript, Black Alchemy, is a hybrid genre work of poetry, theory, and memoir that explores collaborations between writers, excuse me, and visual artists as they map memories of and travels within the African diaspora. Jones's creative scholarship focused on African-American literature and interarts has been published in diverse venues. Their writing and their research and writing has been supported by numerous fellowships: National Humanities Center, Schlesinger, Moreland Spingarn Center, Howard, Rockefeller, Woodrow Wilson, Mellon, and Stanford Humanities Center, and the Carter G. Woodson Institute. Professor Jones comes to us from the Department of English at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm delighted to have her along as our voice in all things literary and poetic in this moment. I am also pleased, yay, let's round for Professor Jones. I'm also pleased to introduce Antonia Randolph, who is an assistant professor of American Studies in my home department. at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is a graduate of Spelman College and Northwestern University, PhD in sociology. Her interests include diversity, discourse and education, multicultural capital, non-normative Black masculinities, and the production of misogyny and hip hop culture. Her book, The Wrong Kind of Different, Challenging the Meaning of Diversity in American Classrooms, examines the hierarchies elementary school teachers constructed among students of color. She's also published in Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, the Feminist Wire. Her current book project, I love this title, That's My Heart, Queering Intimacy and Hip Hop Culture, which is under contract, woohoo, at the University of California Press, and it examines portrayals, big ups, right? Examines portrayals of Black men's intimate relationships and hip hop culture. Again, as I said, my name is Sharon Holland. Maybe I didn't say my location on campus. I'm the former convener of the Critical Ethnic Studies Collective. I'm also chair of the Department of American Studies and a lover of Baldwin. And a big fan of Professor Zaborowska's book. So let's get into it. I'm going to see if I can screen share and if technology will hold up for me. I will do so now. Can you all see that? Give me a little thumbs up if you can. Wonderful.
Yes.
For this discussion of Me and My House, James Baldwin's last decade in France, I hope you can hear the music behind me. The music is from an album produced in the 60s, Gloria Lynn, and also the sonic participant in this lovely collage of albums from James Baldwin's collection at his house. So I'm going to basically do a brief introduction, because I know that even though many of you are here for this book discussion, some of you might not necessarily might be familiar with Baldwin, but not as familiar with the book. Believe me, we'll have all manner of discussions about this wonderful book, and you'll be introduced to it here, and don't feel shy about participating if you haven't had the chance to read the text. Professor Zaborowski's study opens in his house, Baldwin's house, on the edge of Saint-Paul-de-Vence in the south of France. The mood is for memory and its matter. And in these first pages, we witness a pilgrimage of sorts. And I quote from the text, to the site of Baldwin's house, to find that material something that reading his work alone could not provide. For Zaborowska, as well as so many of Baldwin's readers and scholars, and I quote again, on some level, we must all believe that the precious matter of that particular Black life, which ended in that house in 1987, could somehow be salvaged and preserved. In that house, Baldwin's house, Dr. Zaborowska begins to outline the stakes of her project, bringing us the importance of the material life of the great writer, essayist, lover of women, and social justice advocate. In this place, we are called to consider our domestic arrangements, the metaphors we use to describe them, and the material objects, things, rooms. Welcome to my house. Welcome to the sonic life of my house, right? To which we are attached and bound, sometimes happily, and in others, not so much. We are called to see how our erotic lives, our gender, also acts upon these sundry arrangements. As she reminds us much later in the introduction to the book, and I quote again, Baldwin thought deeply about the typically feminine, private, and domestic spheres from the earliest moments of his career. This is really important to me. While reading Baldwin, I discovered my own room, a room of one's own, a room of my own. Moreover, She reminds us that, quote, Baldwin and his female contemporaries and descendants focused steadfastly on the realm of affect and emotion and its interactions with subjects who move in highly differentiated social spaces and fields of vision, whose perspectival access or lack thereof to domesticity often determines their demise or survival. I love this moment in the book's introduction, because it reminds me of the extent to which queer bodies, queer selves, queer lives try to organize themselves in a culture where such organization is articulated through normative modes of relationship to the house, to the home. You'll hear my dog walking around in the background. She always likes it when the jazz is on. So I say again, welcome to my house. Welcome to my home. I hope we create a home together today. Professor Zaborowska pushes back on the critical consensus that Baldwin's later work was somehow not worthy of his earlier literary and critical contributions. And my dog really does feel that this is a problem. Focusing on the essay, Every Goodbye Ain't Gone, she brings us to this later place in his last collection of essays published in 1985, just 2 years before his death. She argues for Baldwin's place as one of the great commentators on that bifurcated thing, and bifurcated is, not even the half of it, called an American identity. In this vein, the three words that her study revolves around and that will perhaps interest us today are home, Blackness, and me, the me being Baldwin. By seeing Baldwin's creative work to the place where he finally put down roots, she attempts to fathom what impact place and home have on the scholar and writer. And she also returned this question to me, this question of my own queer Black life, a doubled otherness, as she says, and its parallels to the living that intersectional dissonance must embrace and refuse. In many ways, what Me and My House discovers is not only a transnational subject, and the last part of what I'm going to talk about gets to that, and then we'll move on, but also this sense of reckoning, of memory, and of racial belonging, and the ways in which that belonging inside racial inhabitation and outside is scripted by us always through the artifacts and objects, right? Through the memories, through the sounds that inhabit our home life. As Professor Zaborowska pays attention to the impact of Europe on Baldwin and his impact on it, she awakens us to his movements in an international intellectual scene between the 1940s and 1980s, and the interdisciplinary homes he traveled in as he moved through African diasporic thought, his own literary genius and that of others, and modes of place, space, and architecture in his own desire to craft a more sustainable inhabitation. In many ways, Zaborowska points us to the fact that Baldwin anticipates the work on Black geographies, that Baldwin anticipates some of the nuances of gender non-conforming life and letters, right? That we see articulated in today's thought. In short, we see the inseparability of Baldwin's domestic and creative imaginations. In these later musings, Baldwin contemplates the French-Algerian situation, affirming again in Every Goodbye Ain't Gone that all identities, and I'm quoting here, in short, I'm quoting from Baldwin, are in question, are about to be made new. Hers is a rich discussion indeed. And I turn now to my colleagues in the field and at UNC to their engagements with the various chapters of the book as they speak to their several fields of inquiry and methods of engagement. And I don't have an order. So, perhaps, maybe I should, but I just decided to let you both decide where you want to go. Who wants to go first? I'm not sure. I can't remember the order of the chapters that you chose to talk about, but I don't really think it matters.
I would focus on chapter 4, and Meta, I don't remember which chapter you focused on. You're muted.
I focused on the faces, foundations, faces, foundations, facades, faces chapter. And so I know that chapter precedes chapter 4, but I'm open either way. It's we're all lovers of Baldwin. So maybe one way for us to proceed would be, Antonia, do you have an image you're using or not? Because maybe if you are
No, I don't have any image.
using image, maybe if you
Hey,
go,
you want to go first since you're the next chapter, right?
Sure, I can go next.
I mean, what about you? You don't, why don't we go on? Because some of the arguments for what you might say might build upon where Antonia is going.
Sure, I'm totally fine going next. Okay, all right. Then I think what we would help is for me to be able to share my image. So let me load that, and then you'll make me co-host so I can screen share, right?
I think you're a panelist and you can screen share, so you should be able to do it.
Yeah. I think earlier, I know it. I was practicing and your image was still up, so that was why it wasn't letting me do it. Okay, no problem. Give me 1 second, and then I will open my image in this new tab. Give me 1 second. Okay.
And while Professor Jones is getting up their slide, I got so excited about being here that I failed to announce that Professor Rebecca Rutledge Fisher was going to join us, but had a sudden death in the family and cannot, and obviously sends her regrets, and our thoughts are with her and her family today.
Absolutely. Okay, so hopefully this image is showing. Is it?
Yes.
I can see. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to first, before we begin, you will notice in this image, before I begin my more formal comments, what I will say is you'll notice that the chapter I mentioned, which is the first chapter, which is not actually the first chapter of Magdalena's beautiful, bold, brilliant, nuanced, interdisciplinary, pictorial, geographic, poetic, introspective, autobiographic book is actually the introduction, where she walks us through, as Professor Holland did. Thank you so much, Dr. Holland. The material space of her own pilgrimage, right, in 2000 to Shea Baldwin's home in southern France. And so the first chapter is really the second chapter that I have excerpted here an image from, and that chapter, looking through a glass blackly, it really has multiple titles. The first title is The Foundations, Facades, Faces. And so I wanted to start with us facing Baldwin's face. So I took this kind of reproduction from that chapter in which the Magdalena Zaborowska, the author herself, included photos that she took. And this matters, not, Baldwin, as she says in that chapter, was so infinitely and expressively photographed. Perhaps only if we're thinking of two other Black men in the 19th and 20th century who also were extensively photographed. One, Langston Hughes, who Baldwin had his own kind of tense and intense relationship with as writers, and in some ways literary, if not rivals, certainly New Yorkers, whether by birth or by migration, and then Frederick Douglass. I mention that because unlike either Frederick Douglass or Langston Hughes, this face here, the image that I'm sharing with you all, is an image in which Magdalena in her book talks about, as many who are Baldwin and lovers of Baldwin know, how much Baldwin, even in his own essays, talked about his ugliness, whereas in contrast, and theorized through what it meant to be perceived as ugly, in contrast to both Frederick Douglass and Langston Hughes, whose physiognomy was often framed as belonging to the aesthetic of the beautiful. You know, that both Hughes, a queer Black man and poet, and Douglass, born enslaved and then broken free, were phenotypically paler in physical pigment, had hair texture and physical features that, and physical stature in terms of height or build that was different than Baldwin's, I think is of note in this framing of the house of the beautiful, to continue with the theme of domesticity. But for here, what is striking, although in that chapter, Magdalena mentions Baldwin's own musings on ugliness in relationship to his own visage. And here I'm using the English pronunciation. I don't speak French, but I looked up. It's striking that that the French word for face is in fact visage. And I wish Rebecca was unfortunately not able to be here with us, because she could massage my pronunciation to greater effect. But here we sit with the visage or visage, as it were, of Baldwin, in which Magdalena speaks of its beauty, the beauty of the orb of his eyes. And I want to take a moment to think about not just the face, but what it means to face the archive, what it meant to think about the home as an archive, and how Magdalena uncovers it. So I'm going to slow us down for a minute and just actually read it. 1.1, a folder with a photograph of Baldwin's eyes on the cover. Description 1.2, from the archive, the cut up photos of Baldwin's face with an open folder. What I want to say as a lover of Baldwin is, you all know in the vernacular that phrase, nose wide, eyes shut, nose wide open, right? That it's actually not just Baldwin's eyes here that were engaging, but his nose, right? The sense of kind of, what does it mean to walk in the house of Baldwin in Southern France, in the aftermath of its death? How many writers, how many scholars, how many of us have made that pilgrimage through the funk, the mustiness of that home before it became torn down, right, and given up to developers? You also note here that I have in the lower half of this frame, I'll put my cursor here, a pinpoint to a silhouette, not a photograph of Baldwin, but a silhouette of Baldwin, and it's pointing to his mouth, right, as if he's speaking. What does it mean to dig into the queer life of Baldwin, the Queerquakes of Baldwin, right? And often when we think about digging in the crates, we go into the realm of the sonic. And in this chapter, Magdalena does indeed walk us through an aspect of the sonic in terms of Baldwin's much quoted, much engaged discussion of his relationship to Bessie Smith, right? And that relationship sonically, not only, which is why it was so beautiful, Sharon, that you began with your house in music, right? And then I can't help but think of house music and its queer kind of relations, right? And so you think in this domain, to dig into the crates with Baldwin, not just avec Baldwin, not just in Baldwin or into Baldwin, is to move not only from the tactility of the face as foundation, the facade, but also into the tactility of the hands and the silhouette that shapes it, right? Silhouettes are cutouts shaped by hands. You'll see here also I have an arrow pointing to the hands. Those are actually Magdalena's hands, right? Holding the archive, touching and opening this folder. And what I'd like to offer and present to us before I move into some of my more formal remarks about this chapter is the way that Magdalena brings us into a form of queer intimacy with Baldwin's life by allowing us to touch her touch, by working through her own interior relation of coming after Baldwin, knowing that this yearning, this desire to touch Baldwin, the writer, as a lover of Baldwin, is not just to touch him in words, but as she says, to touch the materiality of the place he inhabited, the living room, right, where he was, the table where he wrote, and so I think it's important that if we are actually going to engage in the beautiful way she does, the sphere of queer domesticity and queer relationality and what it means, right, for Baldwin, but also to engage non-normative masculinities in the way that he does, even in terms of the fact that kind of Baldwin's younger brother, his beloved brother, David, right, that inherited the home that she writes about, kind of that there are these relationalities that both involve and entail familial inheritances that exceed the framework of the biological, right, but also include it. Right. And so that exceed the framework of Blackness as a race, as familial, as ancestral heritage, but also include it. Right. And so it matters that you can see the contrast between the light fingers holding and grasping with a light touch at the bottom frame of this folder, right, of the dark face, touching the nose that is pictured here. And so the last thing that I want to say is that above the phrase of the top frame of the photograph is a phrase that mentions that this particular photograph was used for an interview with Baldwin, right? Now, Magdalena says it's not known in that moment who that interviewer was, right? And so there are aspects of walking through the home, the lineage of homeland with Baldwin that are still unknown, right? That's what it meant for him to be a sojourner, a traveler, both within the US and outside of it. And so I'm now going to stop here and move to another frame of my remarks. I'm going to stop share to walk us through in a different way of intimacy with Baldwin in Magdalena's viewpoint through her work. And this is those who, I have a good friend who's a poet actually at Duke, and I note that Magdalena's book, both the first Erotics of Exile and this one, was published by Duke University Press. And so I think Duke is a wonderful, in some ways, home place for Baldwin because their earlier lineages, I know that Sharon Holland, White McBride, one of the earlier books and other works on Baldwin have come through Duke Press. So my friend at Duke, Tsitsi Jaji, and I kind of have this banter about how I love to do Shintos. And so for those who aren't poetry, maybe lovers of Baldwin, but not lovers as much of poetry, I'm going to begin my Shinto for Baldwin. A Shinto just takes lines from another's work and composes a creative work. So I took lines from Magdalena's work and made a Shinto poem of it so that I could present her thesis in her words, right, anew. And a Shinto is both a form of honor and reverence, but also a form of imitation and engagement. So I'll pause here, give me just a second. I'm going to close down that image and pull up my Shinto. Give me just a minute. Thank you for your patience. So this is Shinto for Baldwin, for Magdalena, after home. To distill home. Baldwin's politics and poetics of home embody home as baggage and unrequited love. Also cement his fame outside his home country. Apoeosis, never New York City, searching, writing, havens outside his home land. African American migrants from Louisiana and Maryland, sought stability. His mother's right hand helping succession. His homeland tribe. Baldwin never forgot. He maps his genealogy in France. France, again, uprooted in flux. Baldwin made human be possibility. Home and homelessness. Desire for domesticity determined the possibilities. All these fact or affect, author, life, story, Black, queer, American, lived, international, integral, craft, Bessie, artist, center, features, complex, Black, woman, braided, plot, embodies, story, back, water, blues. These are all lines quoted, cut, honed directly, unadulterated, unaltered from, by Baldwin, following from and after him and his home. Magdalena argues in Home that Baldwin followed the home place not only of Bessie, but of Julia in her work, in which home was not the place she wanted to go. Magdalena also follows the home place of Cheryl Wall in this chapter. Cheryl A. Wall, I dedicate my remarks to you today, who fall right after I saw her 3 weeks into the COVID pandemic in April 2020. Magdalena follows Cheryl Wall's call in the quote, blues inflected line of the African American literary tradition that Baldwin follows home that insinuates itself at the beat. Baldwin, like Wall, like Bessie Smith, sung in his writing and his poetry ahead or behind the beat. I follow in closing my remarks with a thesis from Magdalena and a call from someone that calls back to a moment where I sit not in my home, but in the home place of the Queen Anne home here on UNC's campus, where I sat when Randall Keenan, who also followed Baldwin's call, was still alive. He sat here, right there, with none other than Nikki Finney. And he said the words, he sang the words of James Weldon Johnson. I end this call by reading from Nikki Finney's own intro to Jimmy's Blues. Nikki Finney, who sits in Antonia's home, behind her right shoulder there, we see her sit, who brought us home together. This is Nikki Finney following after Baldwin, following his way home. Playing by ear, praying for rain, the poetry of James Baldwin. Baldwin was never afraid to say it. This is Nikki Finney. He made me less afraid to say it too. Gracious and tender, a man who had no idea or concept of his place. What does it mean to find home when one is displaced from one's home as a Black, gay, exiled man in France? This is the question that Magdalena asks and answers by arguing, and this I quote Magdalena directly here, that two powerfully interlinked themes relate to this conundrum-riddled subject. Quote, the necessity to survive away from one's home and difficult childhood, and the desire to create alternative kinds of domesticity and modes of dwelling for Black bodies that do not fit normative gender, sexual, familial, religious, or social roles in design. You have been patient with my designs here today. I will end in saying that I open onto and with you in engaging the gracious and tender and tediously and carefully and tenaciously tilled work of Magdalena Zaborowska, me and my house. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Pat Parker. Thank you, Magdalena. Thank you, Emil, as our critical ethnic studies convener, for allowing me to be a part of this strong. Thank you, Ava, for the tech. Thank you, Christian, for being here. And thank you, those attendees in our reading forum today. Thank you, and Ashe.
Taking us to the poetry, definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Jones. Dr. Randolph.
I mean, I want to let it sit for 2 more beats because Meta was calling us into community in a particular way, and I want to, I'm still listening to the call, so I'm gonna let it sit 2 more beats and gather myself. Wow, what an offering. What a blessing, what a clearing you've created to talk about this work and to talk about Baldwin and all the names that you talked about. I've thought I recognized the space that you're in as the place where Nikki and Randall Keenan were, and that is that space. And Nikki Finney is right behind me. She's always right behind me, along with Princess Tamarine, because that's also very important. Yeah, so where to begin? Thank you again for Pat Parker and Critical Ethnic Studies for inviting me to this gathering. I'm a huge Baldwin fan, and I wouldn't be here without Baldwin, and that seems hyperbolic, but it isn't. I wouldn't be here without Baldwin. And I've only written about Baldwin once in a edited collection about New Black sociology, and I decided to write about Baldwin as a social theorist. But I haven't written about Baldwin because he's too close to me. And so this idea of queer intimacy really resonates with me in terms of what Zaborowska is up to in this book and the importance of thinking about intimacy and domesticity in Baldwin's work. So what I responded to was the 4th chapter, Building Metaphors. And I just want to give a couple of quick thoughts about it so that we can leave time to have, responses from the audience. I've been working in my book project thinking about affect and interpersonal relationships as represented in hip hop. And so I'm trying to develop a mode of analysis that is paying attention to affect and relationships and how that in turn creates the kind of angles of vision that we see in people's work and in culture. And so I think in this chapter, Building Metaphors is thinking about the relationships that Baldwin describes in his last few books, particularly If Beale Street Can Talk, Just Above My Head, Evidence of Things Not Seen. The later works, as Sharon said, the later works that people look more dimly on than their first works from when he first started. And so affect, emotions as a method, but then also as a analytic. And I actually want to start in thinking about something that you said, Meta, in terms of looking at Baldwin's face. I want to offer a counter framing about Baldwin as ugly. One of the reasons I responded to Baldwin was because I was ugly. Like, people thought I was ugly growing up. And that was really important to have an author, to read an author who talked very candidly about what it meant to be ugly. And as a a social scientist, I know about the social construction of ugliness. And I think it's useful to think about Baldwin's ugliness as um, um, intrinsic to the kind of writing he did. So I want to, Baldwin might be pretty, but he was also ugly. Socially, he was ugly. And I was just talking last week, actually, doing this book, reading group about Deshaun Harrison's The Belly of the Beast, which is all about the Black fat and the way that ugliness, you can't just throw off ugliness by having better, having higher self-esteem. So I want to mark ugliness as a useful social thing that exists in the world, and all get, like, he bought and paid for his ugliness, just like I bought and paid for my ugliness as a way of knowing. So that it's nothing to nothing to retreat from. And so that's part of what I'm trying to bring to this chapter, and what Magdalena Zaborowska is doing in this chapter, thinking about affect. What sort of emotions is Baldwin working in, and what is it? What are those emotions do in the world? So emotions and relationships, and these are just kind of impressionistic responses to the chapter, because boy, this chapter is giant size. It's a long chapter. She covers a lot of things, so they can only just be impressions. One thing that I thought of in terms of this theme about emotions and then also relationships is she's talking about how she's contrasting evidence of things not seen, which is about the Atlanta child murders, and how he's he's indicting the United States as a nation, as a matter, the house of the nation. That house, United States as a nation, is like a house that is rejecting everything that is seen as foreign to the house. So putting that as one part of his theorizing, versus if Beale Street can talk, and then especially just above my head as a Black domestic space of refuge, those types of contrasts. But in his essays, maybe less so than his novels, they're marked by a humanism. I mean, I think anybody who writes about Baldwin talks about his humanism, and he talks about his right to love America, and how he's been all over the world, but he's finally an American, and how he came to know his Americanness acutely when he left the United States. And for the first time, or I heard that differently now that I'm an older person reading Baldwin, and the affect that I thought of as I was thinking about his humanism is sentimentality. And so his humanism has always been interesting to me, because he was such a rigorous thinker, and then he came to the conclusion that the solution is to love each other better. And based on the premise of what he would be saying, and is, the fire next time, his offering of, and what we should do is love each other better, I would be left cold. And I thought, oh, well, that's sentimentality. That's cruel optimism, and Lauren Berlant's idea that you're loving things that are against your thriving. And, he's allowed that. But I think thinking about it in terms of what kind of emotional hold, does the idea of the nation have on Baldwin? Because at the same time period, people were saying national borders are something that we need to get rid of, that there's, Pan-Africanism at the same time, but he holds on to the nation, and he holds on to a nationalistic belief in the American project. And there's you can find someplace else. And so you don't have to come to that. And so in this reading of Baldwin and Evidence of Things Not Seen, his critique of the Atlanta child murders and the indifference to the death of Black children, even in that kind of he was so spent on the idea of the nation, but he held on to it. That kind of optimism reminded me of the things that he critiqued in Everybody's Protest novel. So he's not so far from Richard Wright in terms of believing in the American project, because he has a soft place in his heart for the United States. You know, it's tender for him. And so how does affective analysis help us understand, what Baldwin argues, even kind of despite his knowing better, he loves the United States. Despite his knowing better, he loves the United States. So that's one thing that I was thought of as I was reading this this chapter. What does affect give us? Also, I was really struck by her analysis of the episode of Soul, that 70s TV show that what brought on famous Black musicians and authors of the day, where she was talking with Nikki Giovanni. And that's been, that conversation has been collected as a book, the conversation between he and Nikki Giovanni. And actually there's a film about the TV show Soul, so you can see that excerpts from it if you want to watch that. It's streaming online. And what she said about that conversation between he and Nikki Giovanni was that it was an important sign of him passing the torch to a younger generation. And it was especially important because he was welcoming in Black feminist authors. This was him giving his blessing to Black feminist authors and being open to critique about, I may have gone too easy on the brothers, but now y'all got it. I'm happy. I'm exhausted, really. I'm happy to pass on the torch to you. And I thought that was an important thing to track Baldwin as a feminist in the characters he creates, but then also in actually lending his credibility in terms of saying the people who are up next are actually the Black feminist authors. It's Maya, it's Toni, it's Alice Walker. Those are the people up next. Still, I was struck by Zaborowska's discussion of how the TV show framed the conversation between he and Nikki Giovanni, and even more than a TV show, how the book that came out of it framed them. She said they were framed as though they were a couple, a romantic couple, in a conversation where they're letting the dirty laundry of the African American community out, and what are the kind of limitations of treating a conversation between much older James Baldwin and known to be gay James Baldwin, and then Nikki Giovanni, who wasn't thought to be gay at that time, but pregnant pause. But so Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni, Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni in this conversation being framed as a heterosexual couple. And what Zaborowska talked about here was that it's flattening out, it's neutralizing Baldwin's gayness. But for my purposes, because I'm thinking about different types of relationships and their possibilities, the couple form itself has its own conventions. So you could have framed them as friends in conversation, as rivals in conversation, but as a couple, they're, they should be working towards the same goal. They should have affection with each other. The couple itself, separate from the sexual orientation attached to couples, have its own sort of script, and that scripting does something. And so I think if you attend to the affective parts of what Baldwin is doing and how his work is taken up, but then also the relationships that they center, like we have kind of different opportunities to see what we can imagine and what we can't imagine. So not just the flattening of Baldwin's sexual orientation, but what does it mean to frame him as a couple versus Baldwin in conversation with William F. Buckley. I know they're different races, but you'd see that differently. Like these are both intellectual powerhouses who are going to fight it out. But when Nikki Giovanni and Baldwin talk, they are a romantic couple bickering. We know they're not a romantic couple in the first place, but then also the couple as a form leads you to certain kinds of expectations of that conversation. And so that's what I was thinking of, using my own kind of lenses when I'm thinking about right now in my research. And then finally, Just Above My Head, which my favorite Baldwin novel, Just Above My Head, she talks about that extensively in the chapter. And she talks about the utopian possibilities of the domestic queer space. So in Just Above My Head, especially the relationship between Arthur and Jimmy, but then also this idea of Julia and her single Black woman life and her beautiful house that is welcoming to all kinds of genders, all types of sexual orientations. And those are two examples of the possibility of the domestic queer space as a possible redemptive space, as opposed to a heteropatriarchal Christian domesticity that we saw fall apart in Just Above My Head in the case of Julia's family of origin. What I thought about here was this, and Zaborowska calls this out, is that there's a romantic relationship between Julia and Arthur, or Julia and Hall, who is Arthur's big brother. So, but they grew up kind of like brothers and sisters. They're not actually brothers and sisters, but they're close friends in Just Above My Head. And then when they get to be adults, they see each other again, and then they become lovers for a time. And Zaborowska notes that is an almost incestuous relationship where they were as close as siblings, and then as adults, they used to hate each other. And then as adults, they find each other again and become lovers for a time. And if thinking about different types of relationships, what does it say that you have to be as close as siblings to have this possibility of having a mutual understanding? And even more so, Jimmy and Arthur, who are the domestic queer utopian ideal, they were like brothers, and they are the example of a loving relationship. And what does it matter, or what should we make of the fact of they do become lovers as adults and have this fulfilling life, and they're everything to each other. They're lovers, they're bandmates, they're best friends. They blur the boundaries between different types of relationships. And what about that? What about all-encompassing relationships? Is that the possibility for Black spaces that are refuge from white supremacists, heteropatriarchy? Shout out to bell hooks. So just thinking about the types of affective dimensions of Baldwin's writings, intentional and unintentional, and the kind of relationships that we as Black scholars center on, and what are those possibilities, and what are some of the unintended consequences of those things. But this book is so rich and so kaleidoscopic that I couldn't possibly, give a rendition of all the things it offers us. But those are some of the things that stood out for me in reading it. Thank you.
Wow.
It was brilliant. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's awesome.
Thank you, both of you, for bringing us the full spectrum, right, of this amazing work of Baldwin's light that still shines in us and on us. What I'd like to do now, wow, I'm glad you made us all take a beat before, Dr. Randolph. I would love to see, we have about 20 minutes, which is great, for us to discuss some of the insights our panelists have brought forward, and for us to talk amongst ourselves. But I'm not sure if Kristen or Ava are looking at the chat. I haven't paid it. I don't know if there's anything going on, but if folks have a question they want to bring forward to us as panelists, to the individual talks and reflections we've had.
No questions yet, but yes, feel free to either type in a chat or raise your hand if you have a question.
While we're waiting, can I ask a question of either one of you panelists while we're waiting for the attendees to ask a question? Thank you, first of all, both of you. That was so, it was so generative, like bubbling over in these different directions. And I was thinking, my question for you, Dr. Randolph, is I loved the insight of thinking about how in the book, what Magdalena does through her reading of a conversation that has both been transcribed, right? Publishes a book, as you noted in your filmed, like first, right? Quoted and analyzed by different scholars. One of the early works on Gail Walds several years ago did a book on soul that looked at that conversation as well. That it's these different forms. And then you added the insight of how this breaking down of the heteronormative expectations of the couple as a form, as a literal, right, form. I wondered, is there any relationship that, pun intended, that couples the deconstruction of the aesthetics of the beautiful and the ugly, right, as a form of power with the breaking out or the bubbling over of these very constricted boundaries and expectations of the couple, right? Because I thought it's a really powerful intervention, and I thought that one of the things about that in the opening of your remarks is that it's really, really important to me to hear from you or from Dr. Holland as well, since this is a reading and discussion group, but we also work at a university, that often teaching Baldwin, I find that either when you start talking about the strictures he breaks out, or you talk about his discussion and his theorization from the frame of beauty or ugliness and its social constructions, how too easily students sometimes slip into reading that not as critique, but as pathology, right? It's this kind of, and Magdalena's book does not do that, right? And I was really happy to see that. So I'm really wondering about form, right? And if there's a relationship between that in your talk. And then for Dr. Holland, I know much is made about Baldwin and blues's form, but I wondered, since you brought us to your house, if there are other musical forms you think we should listen to, or that listening to would better break open this book for us, or break into in different ways to our understandings of Baldwin. So those are my kind of thrown out questions. And now it looks like someone has asked a question in the chat maybe by now. So anyway, thank you.
Dr. Randolph, you want to?
I'll try. That was a provocative question to try to link my first remark, kind of off the cuff remarks about ugliness to me thinking about the couple as a form. I think they have in common trying to get away from normative conventions that we may not realize we're functioning within. So in me writing this book about hip hop, because the hip hop book is not about queer subjects. It's not about queer subjects, but I'm saying there are queer things going on. And it made me notice that queer theory has not given me great tools to think about non-normativity outside of sexual, same-sex sexual behavior. Like there's a limit to the imagination of queer theory, where you're looking for gay subjects, you're looking for your non-normative, self-avowed non-normative stuff, and then you may not notice that the couple form is something that gay people and straight people share in common. And what are those conventions, and what does that produce in society? And so in the same sort of way, maybe thinking about pretty versus ugly is things that we take for granted across kind of identities. And there might be a prior question to ask. So what is the unthought of questions in somehow? And not that I'm some type of guru of things, but I guess going back to sort of grounded in my own subjectivity, because I knew what I knew what it meant to grow up to be ugly. I knew sort of a binary isn't going to do the thing for us that we might think it would do for us, ugly versus pretty. And, you know, Tracy McMillan Cotton got there first too in her book, Thick. There's a whole chapter about what ugly means, and Deshaun Harrison is kind of doing something else.
Yeah.
But, you know, some things that we all hold in common. Of course, there's the couple, you know, but there's more thinking to be done. And so that's what I'm happening upon in trying to think about subjects who, you know, unless you're active, like if you're not doing things that are same-sex attracted, queer theory may not have a lot of use for you or something, but there might be something still to be said about the categories we think in. That wasn't as eloquent as I wanted to be, but that's what I have at this moment.
You
That
inspire.
was brilliant. You
Yeah.
totally inspired me.
Because what are you talking about?
Okay, if that wasn't eloquent, we all gonna be hushed now. So okay,
I know.
I know she just went boom, boom. Oh yeah, that wasn't that okay. All right, Dr. Randolph.
I want to just add to that, right? Because, you know, when you're talking about you know, ugliness, and when you're talking about the social, I keep thinking about you know, affect and how we're supposed to live our institutional lives, right? And how a lot of there's a quote that's at the end of my signature line, and it's from Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And this kind of face forward facade that we bring into university settings means I ask questions that make people uncomfortable all the time, that I am always already inappropriate, that I am always already consigned to the space of what the rules are. Here's the rule for how to talk about DEI on campus. Here's the rule for how to, and I break that rule. Why? Because I don't think the campus, sometimes university life, and this could be our campus or any other, but I only speak to ours, understands what its culture is. There's not a multicultural space. It's a space with a particular predominant culture that those of us who occupy other multicultural actual spaces then need to contend with, right? Thus the ugliness of my question. Thus the ugliness of breaking the reprieve of conformity that is always already the option for institutions. So thank you for bringing me back, you know, to that stereotype, and also bringing me back to, you know, that prevailing stereotype of the angry Black woman that Baldwin really massages in his work in particular ways. But I know we're getting on time, so I won't say anything. I can go on and on about that, or about my institutional life, since I've had so many versions of them. But I'd love to, Mayta, you said there was a question that came forward, and Pat, you had your hand up for a second. I don't know.
Yeah. But just before we get to, I just want to but just mark. I need to mark what you just brought, Sharon, in terms of, responding to what Dr. Randolph and Dr. Jones has laid before us in some of these questions. And what I want to mark is what you talked about in terms of academia, this campus, and sort of calling the question of, is this a multicultural space? I mean, that's the question in the United States, in our democracy right now, right? Right? Are we a plural democracy? And is this are we occupying this multicultural space? And I use that word occupy in very intentional language, because that goes back to another aspect of our history that we've not faced as a country in terms of being on this occupied land. So I want to mark that you brought that into our consciousness right now in this conversation, and to say that it is absolutely related to the theme that the Institute is is focusing on as part of our Race Memory and Reckoning initiative, this idea of belonging. What does it mean to belong to this place? If belonging is to be a co-creator and a co-owner of a culture, of a place, what does that look like? So thank you for bringing that, that theme into sharp focus, and we'll be exploring that and just, talking more about it as we go along. So just wanted to mark that, and we can move on to the question that's in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, someone I can't see the question.
I'm
That's
not seeing a question. I don't know if you saw one, Meta.
no, I thought I saw a question and answer. There's nothing in there. But I'm just overwhelmed right now with the poetry of this moment. And I just want to mark that too. I mean, being here in this space, and I just want to say, I want to honor you, Pat, as the director of the IAH, as that means a lot to me. And I want to thank you for your leadership, and for,
Yes.
bringing Professor
Yes.
Zaborowska and her work to this campus, and the meaning of
Thank you.
Baldwin for our time in this moment is so rich. I mean, every time I look in every time I'm in something, they say you got to choose your battles wisely. But what my grandmother used to say is, people don't understand there's a battle every second. Some of us don't get to choose them wisely. Some of us must walk through our survival. And that thing, whenever I think I'm going to say something, and I heard you, both of you, when you're thinking about, just the way in which you parse the line, Meta, right? The poetry of bringing someone's words forward in a way that, is generative. And also, I'm just thinking about the ways in which, I don't have a question here. I just want to say, you all have, I'm going to go read just above my head. Yes, I am. I'm going to go.
I know.
Every time I get one of these Baldwin things, I go
I
through
know.
what I call another rabbit hole. Look, I got all of them,
Right.
I was supposed to be writing my introduction this weekend, and I ended up reading half a novel. And I was just like, stop, because, I can't seem to get, out of Baldwin's richness for this now. And the way that Professor Zaborowska's work returns us to the multidimensional nature of Baldwin, which is something, I see so much she's so right. I see so much compartmentalization in our critical approach to Baldwin. He is either a civil rights person or a gay man. He is, either, no. So, I don't know if we've got about 5 minutes. I don't know if there's anything, is there any question, anything you want to add, Emil? I saw you kind of, lean in there for a second.
No, I'm I'm still in the moment, enjoying the poetry and Antonio's intervention. I'm just here to learn, and I'm so grateful that I'm part of this conversation right now.
And thank you. I will say this, Dr. Holland, thank you so much for acknowledging both Dr. Parker and Dr. Kame, because for me, something that you said, Dr. Randolph, right after my remarks, that I was calling us into community, I was trying to model what already the IH is doing by doing this book forum, and trying to model what Magdalena does in the book, right? Is that, at first I had this, and this is one of those things I would think about what the book offers. It's one thing to speak interdisciplinarity, which is what the IH's goal is, right? To bring arts and humanities in conversation, to get out of our disciplinary homes and silos, even if our disciplinary within our departments, we know that our disciplines are varied anyway. It's not like, communications isn't one thing, American studies isn't one thing, right? But we still have these kind of tenets. And so what I appreciated about what you said about the line in the poetic is that the call into community, we've lost people. We lost Baldwin, and that matters. We lost Randall, and that still matters, right? And the convention of, and Nathan was here with us in our physical midst, in UNC's institutional home space, right? In this physical space, literally in February, and 6 weeks later, we were all what we're doing now on Zoom, right? And so there are things we gained from that, like the opportunity to have people log in who maybe wouldn't be able to come to UNC's campus, but there are tons of prices of many tickets paid. And so one thing I think by choosing this book as a part of the Race Reckoning Initiative, and this being one of the many events you're doing, is it doesn't allow us to stay in our silos. It's a book that says, look, like in the chapter that I was reading, when she talks about faces, one of the things I love that she says, which is true, is that even what you said, Dr. Randolph, when you were talking about queer theory's usefulness in some categories, but not being perceived as being useful in others because of certain limits, imaginatory limits of structures within it. She's like, even sometimes people saying, okay, this face of Baldwin means this, right? Even the photographs that people select or choose of him to use, whether it's for like the everyman Baldwin or a certain kind of cover, like, and it matters to me. I want to thank you again, Pat Parker, because I will speak here what I've said privately before, my pain and how the complexity of the many faces of Randall Keenan were erased in some institutional ways right after his passing, and some of the communication documents that were giving synopses of who he was and what his life was. And and that's not me kind of trying to, none of those people are even on the Zoom call, but it's not about shaming institutional structures. It's not about, you know, dinging people. It's about saying that if we don't have events like this, if we don't have work that continuously reminds us of the complexities of who each of us are, of who Baldwin was, of who Randall Keenan was and still is in spirit present with us, then we lose that richness, the very richness that brought us all, you know, together on this reading forum today. And so I also second Sharon in thanking you, and I thank you, Emil, for being present and taking on the mantle of the Critical Ethnic Studies Collective in that convening, because any, you know, lover Baldwin knows that Baldwin wrote very acutely about multiple ethnicities, not just Blackness, right? And what does that mean, right? What does it mean that if we only turn to Baldwin and think about this through that lens without that expansive comparative ethnicity and ethnic relationality and seeing that was also built within his novels and his work and his often underappreciated poetry. I had to get the point. I had to get the poetry in, you know.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jones. You know, I think maybe, I don't know. I know, oh, it's 1:45. I don't know if anyone has any closing words. I was going to read something from Baldwin, but I think, you know, I can just leave it at that. Like,
Yeah, would you please do?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just going to be selfish here. Giovanni's room is my jam. You know, we can have another session where we talk about Baldwin and all the novels that we're like, you know, it's just like with Toni Morrison, like people are like, not Sula, I'm Bluest Eye. I'm like, I'm Beloved or what have you. So I'm Giovanni's room. I believe that Baldwin wrote one of the most amazing and incredible first paragraphs of any American novel. And I'll attest to that. Maybe you'll figure that out. Part 1. I stand at the window of this great house in the south of France as night falls, the night which is leading me to the most terrible morning of my life. I have a drink in my hand. There is a bottle at my elbow. I watch my reflection in the darkening gleam of the window pane. My reflection is tall, perhaps like an arrow. My blonde hair gleams. My face is like a face you have seen many times. My ancestors conquered a continent, pushing across death-laden plains, until they came to an ocean which faced away from Europe into a darker past.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. And with that, I think we can close and continue to contemplate Baldwin in this moment. And thank each of you for what you brought to this conversation. This really is sort of the kickoff of our Race, Memory, and Reckoning initiative for this year, this So thank you so much. Thank you for
you.
American Studies, for the Critical Ethnic Studies Collective, and for each of you for being here. So
Thank
with
you.
that, I think we will end
You're
our
welcome.
Thank you.
webinar.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.